Warning, this is going to be one of my more inflammatory videos, as it reflects the sort of rootless criticism of conventional wisdom, the average person's beliefs, and the consequences associated with them that sits at the foundation of this channel. I will make no attempt to mince words here, because everything I will say is logically defensible, which makes the fact that it will be offensive to so many not just tolerable, but honestly satisfying. I love when the most effective criticism of what I have to say is just a whine about it being mean to say. An article, recently, relative to the release of this video, came out from the BBC describing how Greek police are carrying out pushback policies. Pushback is the euphemism for violently turning back migrants who are attempting to enter the country to stay in it or pass through it into another, through means other than the typical ports of entry. The article points to allegations that migrants are being deployed to push back other migrants, and that they are engaging in sexual harassment, torture, and theft, among other abuses in doing so.
A report by the EU Border Agency's independent investigator found that, on the available evidence, these men are part of a group that's armed and acting under Greek police orders. Migrants themselves, their job here, to force other migrants onto boats back to Turkey.
My response to this, directed at those who believe in closing borders, is a resounding, what did you expect? When people propose closing borders to migrants, they really treat it like it means turning on some invisible barrier on international borders, like it's a video game or something. No wonder things like building literal walls and fences on borders appeal to so many. But the problem with just closing borders off to migrants, any physical barrier that you put up is going to have to be manned or monitored by someone. And the problem with just closing borders off to migrants to decrease or even eliminate immigration is so obvious that it's essentially basic physics. Pushback, mind you, is illegal under international law, for what that's worth in the modern day. The process of dealing with migrants is supposed to involve taking them in, processing their case, and then, if you reject asylum, deporting them. But good luck convincing people who intend to reject essentially anyone anyway to support investing a massive amount of resources and time into what it takes to give people a due process that's going to produce essentially the same results roughly every time anyway. So they are just going to cut to the chase and push people back.
A group of migrants declare they've just crossed the Evros River into Greece. It's June 2023. They want to claim asylum. But later, masked men run towards them. There's panic.
The result is a two-pronged incentive towards maximum cruelty. On one prong, in order to disincentivize people from taking the risk of attempting to get into another country this way, you have to ensure that the journey to do so is obviously more painful than not attempting the journey, which is really tough to do when people are desperately escaping extreme poverty and violence. You need people who are willing to actually enforce that pain cost on these desperate men, women, and children. Inevitably, the type of person most willing to do that is going to be those more likely to commit sexual assault, torture, and theft, whether or not they're migrants. Though if they're migrants, you get the added sick benefit of them themselves wanting to escape from their circumstances and being willing to do anything to do so. Though, to be honest, even those people are morally superior to those who want these borders closed but wring their hands on the outside about the consequences of doing so, because at least they put their bodies on the line for it. You can attempt to mitigate this by policing those doing this policing, but ultimately, closed borders is a policy that demands cruelty. As migration pressure gets higher, as the world becomes more violent and desperate thanks to the climate crisis, never mind the ongoing energy and food crisis, as of this video, caused by current world conflicts, the cruelty required to enforce these migration restrictions will only magnify. You could hypothetically address part of this equation with more automation. Think of those robot dogs currently being built. But one, the other prong of cruelty maximization is still in play, and two, it's a ticking clock before those robotic sentinels are turned inward by someone or something, which, frankly, any society willing to deploy such machines on their borders would deserve. There are really only two alternatives to this closed border policy and its consequences, which I'll save going into greater detail on for their own videos, but right now I can outline. One is the politically and materially easier one, which is to end the desire for closed borders entirely and move towards a system of controlled but, dare I say it, open borders. We can have a discussion about what that looks like. I am sympathetic to aggressive programs to ensure integration and avoid the issue of migrants becoming an economic burden. However, there are potentially vast economic benefits. If nothing else, building the type of society capable of helping the most marginalized people should serve to help all marginalized people. And in our current economic system, essentially anyone who isn't a billionaire is to some extent marginalized. Never mind the studies that show that global freedom of movement would increase global productivity, even within our existing order. I will not pretend that there are no real difficulties, but if you don't want to impose systematic terror on migrants, this is one of two solutions. Another, harder alternative is to address the push factors of migration where they originate. That means making the nations migrants are escaping from tolerable enough to live in that people do not want to attempt migratory journeys in the first place. The typical liberal position here, foreign aid, is insufficient in the current circumstances and moving forward, if it ever was sufficient. The typical leftist position, massive reparations and an end to economic imperialism, is also at this stage insufficient, if it was ever sufficient. In the same way that in rich countries there are powerful forces that benefit from the destructive status quo, the same is true in poorer countries. They do not disappear with the typical liberal or leftist solutions. They need to be deliberately dislodged. This would be a massively expensive project that would, in some sense, imply the single greatest intervention in the affair of the global south since the peak of colonialism. Not exactly something that any part of the political spectrum is currently interested in undertaking. You're not really supporting order, sovereignty, or stability. You're supporting a system that only functions through escalating brutality, carried out by people incentivized to be as cruel as necessary to make it work, and vacuum up the type of person willing to do so. You do not get to separate policy from its consequences. Either you accept the consequences in full and reveal your politics for what they actually are, shorn of fraudulent appeals to humanity, or you choose an alternative that does not rely on systematic violence against the marginalized. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe.